In this lecture we'll be finishing off our rig with IK and a few more bones, and we'll be symmetrizing the bones from one side to the other. Okay, so here's where we got up to last time, and the first thing I want us to do is set up the IK for the leg, as we're practiced with that now. But before we do that, let's just take a look at our bones a little bit closer. I'll go into pose mode, so Control Tab, pose mode, and if I select on my hip bone, we can see that the thigh bone or the upper leg is parented to that hip bone. So if I press R to rotate on this, the leg moves with it. And it looks like our hip bone is attached to our spine 1 bone just here. But if I select the hip bone and press G to grab, we can see that it's not actually connected. So I'll right click to cancel that movement. Ideally, we do want the connection here so that when we move the spine bone, the whole body goes with it. So do be aware that it's not always the case that when two bones are touching like this, that they're connected. And it's a good idea to test your relationships to make sure you don't forget those things. So I'll go back into edit mode with Tab. I'll select my hip bone and select spine 1 and Control P. And you might think again that I'd choose connected, but if I choose connected, it jumps to the tail of the bone. So I'll undo that and press Control P and keep offset. So now when I go into pose mode with Control Tab and unselect my spine bone, it moves everything. Okay, so pause the video there and just make that connection between the hip bone and spine 1. Okay, so let's give you a challenge of setting up the IK for the leg. One thing this time to remember is that you will need to put the chain length of 2 in the IK settings because we've attached more bones to the chain. Pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, so hopefully you got an okay with that, and you remembered that we need 2 extra bones. I'll come to side view for that. Make sure I'm in edit mode with Tab, and we want to start with a target, so E to extrude in the Y, and bring that out there, and a pole bone up here, E to extrude in the Y up here. Now for both these bones we need to clear the parent, so I can select the bone, Alt P, clear parent, and select the other bone, Alt P, clear parent. For the pole target we want to bring that out to the front so the knee can kind of point at it, and I'll rename the bones, so this is pole.L, and it's worth mentioning for this rig I'm not setting up an IK for the arm. If I did have more IK on the character, then I'd need to be more specific about the name. I'll jump to the target, F2, target.L. So now we're ready to set up the IK. So we can jump to pose mode for this. Hopefully you remember to do that. So Control Tab, pose mode, and the IK is the one at the end of the chain. So our target is controlling this bone here. So that's the shin bone. And do remember you can see your names up to the top left if you're unsure. I'll come down to the bone constraints, add bone constraint, inverse kinematics. I'll use the picker to select the armature, and then under bone I'll start typing in target, and you can see target.L pops up. Now before I put the chain length in, I'll just show you what happens if I move the target bone, G to grab, it moves everything in the entire chain. So I'll undo that, select my shin bone and choose a chain length of 2. So that's 1, 2 just there, and again select my target and you can see it's only affecting 2 bones now. I'll reselect the shin bone, and for the pole target, again, I'll choose the armature, and I'll start typing in pole, and you can see pole.L just there. Again, it does that strange rotation. -90 tends to do it, yep. And remember, you can just click and drag to see where that's likely to be. Okay, so we're almost there. Let's test it out. If I press G to grab, move this up. That's good, but our foot bone is rotating with the shin bone. So I'll remove that movement with Alt G. Select our foot bone now, because we want to disconnect this from our shin bone. So into edit mode, Alt P, and clear parent. Back into pose mode, so we can add a constraint to our constraints menu, add bone constraint, and copy location. And we're choosing, once again, the armature, and then the shin bone. So shin.L just there. It jumps to the top of the bone, of course, so we need to change it to the tail. Let's quickly test that out. And it's keeping its rotation, which is great. So hopefully you got an okay with that. Let's just quickly check out the pole target. If I press G to grab and move it up, and then use the pole target, G to grab and move it across, it's not working too badly, but we can see it's splayed out this way slightly. Let's grab the target bone again, and G to grab. We can see it's sort of working, but really the knee joint should only rotate around the x-axis. And when it points at the pole, it's actually the hip that's kind of controlling or moving that knee direction than the knee joint itself. So what we can do to help that is, if I select the shin bone, I want to change the IK so it only rotates this bone around the x-axis. Now you might expect this to be in the bone constraint, but it's actually in the bone properties, and then inverse kinematics. And I can lock the Y and the Z, and you can see now it's locked in that X-axis, so it's making much more sense. When I move the pole target, it looks much more like a knee joint now. It's still able to kind of swivel, but that's more at the hips. So I'll press Alt-G to remove any movement there, and the same for the pole target, Alt-G. And we've got a good IK setup now. So now's a good time to catch up with me and make sure you haven't missed anything with the IK setup. And remember to constrain the shin bone to just the X-axis in rotation. Now there's a little bit more that we'll want to do. If I select spine 1 now and press G to grab, it's good, but ideally we want a bone that we can move that moves the whole rig all together. Otherwise it's slightly inefficient and I have to select the spine bone, the target and the pole and press G to grab, and that's how I can move my whole rig. So ideally we want a main bone, or what we call a root bone, to control everything. So let's jump back to edit mode. I'll press Shift S to move the cursor to the world origin and Shift A to add, and that adds a single bone. Now I want this to be aligned with the grid perfectly, so I'll turn on snapping and I'll change it to increment so it snaps to the grid. And I'll go to side view, G to grab, and move that down to the grid just here. We want it fairly big so we can select it nice and easily, so 0.5 or 0.6 in this case, Blender units, is absolutely fine. The other thing that's worth mentioning is that this is aligned to the world origin. It's much easier to visualize if it's got the same local orientation as the world orientation. So that's obviously Z going up, X across, and Y going backwards there. That should be set up like this, as long as when we first added our bone in object mode, we didn't move that bone around in any way. So if I press Control Tab to go back to object mode, press N on my keyboard, we shouldn't have any rotation here on our character. If you have for any reason, remember you can press Control A to apply the rotation to make sure this is back to 0. Okay, so back into edit mode, and we want to parent those bones to the root bone. One other thing that's very useful is having a bone for the hips, or the whole pelvis here, because selecting this bone in here can be a little bit awkward. It's nice to be able to have one that sticks out this way, and it's helpful as well if we just keep this one to rotation for the spine rather than movement of the hips. So generally speaking, you have a hip controller or pelvis controller sticking out here. So I'll move in to this area, select the bottom there if I can, 3 to go to side view, E to extrude out at the back there, and I'll call this hip controller or pelvis controller or whatever you might want to. And whilst I'm here, I'll label the bottom one the root bone. So let's sort out the relationships now. I want my spine to be parented to my hip controller. So select the spine, select the hip controller, Control P, and keep offset, of course, because we don't want it jumping to the back. The hip controller, I need to be parented to the root bone, so I can select that, Control P, keep offset. The target bone as well, so I'll select that, the root bone, Control P, keep offset. Now the pole target, you can attach to this root bone down here, but actually, let's just jump into pose mode for a moment. So Control Tab, pose mode, and select my target bone. If I press G to grab and move this up, in fact, let's turn snapping off so that doesn't cause any problems. You can see that I always want the pole target to be in front of this control bone. If it moves behind, it goes a little bit dislocated. So I'll select the target bone, Alt-G, and go back to edit mode. I may as well choose my pole bone and parent it to the target bone, so Control P, keep offset. So that way, again into pose mode, when I move my IK controller, the pole will always move in front with it. So I'll press Alt-G to cancel that. So I should have everything set up now. Let's just take a look and test it out. First of all, I'll select my root bone and press G to grab, and the whole armature should move. That's great. We've just tested the target bone, but let's do that again. Move that around, the legs moving perfectly. I've got my hip controller here that I can move the hips of the character. Now I can still, of course, move my spine 1 and everything moves as well. That doesn't matter too much. It's just much easier to select the hip controller here instead. So again, now's a good time to catch up with me and set up your root bone, your hip controller, and make sure the parenting all makes sense. Okay, so the rig's all working. The last thing to do then is symmetrize this to the other side. Before we do that though, there are a few bones here that we don't want to influence the mesh. So for example, the root bone, if I select that, we only want that controlling other bones, not the mesh itself. We leave these deformed bones as they were. They are the bones that we want to have weights or vertex groups of the mesh associated with them. So these extra bones that we've added, the hip controller, the target, the pole, and the root bone, we want to turn off their influence on the mesh. They only want to influence the armature. If we jump to edit mode with tab, under the bone properties, we've got an option deform. So we need to just quickly go through each of these, selecting them and turning off the deform option. And now we're ready to symmetrize. That's nice and easy because we've labeled everything correctly. We can select all our mesh, in edit mode of course, right click and symmetrize. And now if I click on any of these bones, you can see they've got a .r suffix. Because we had the .l on the other side, you can see they've all updated with that .r. If I go into pose mode, we've even got the IK set up as well. Okay, so the final thing then is to catch it with me, turning off the deform option for those controller bones that are only there to control the rig. And once you've done that, symmetrize your armature, and of course make sure you save your work, ready for next time.